Good morning. Today we are going to discuss Module 12 and 13 keywords and then Jomo Kenyatta's short story, Gentleman of the Jungle. So let's begin with the keywords. The first keyword that I'm going to discuss is neocolonialism and neo-imperialism. Now, I hope we already are on the same page as far as understanding what colonialism and imperialism mean. Just to briefly sum up, colonialism is the actual practice of invading, conquering, and taking over the resources, human and otherwise, of a group of people. Now, colonialism can be settler colonialism, as in the United States or Australia or South Africa, or it can simply be the kind of colonialism where it's just the exploitation of resources, like in India or in certain African countries. Imperialism is the ideology that powers colonialism, the idea that because we belong to, let's say, a better in the sense of like more technologically advanced culture, we have the right to go invade other people and civilize them. There's a whole imperialist ideology behind it. So we can say imperialism is a thought that runs colonialism. Though historically, imperialism always follows on later, because imperialism also comes with justifications of why it was necessary to colonize these people. And those justifications, you will notice, are never monetary justifications. They are generally justifications about Christianizing them or bringing them culture or something of the sort. Now, discussing neocolonialism and neo-imperialism, as I think I have mentioned a couple of times in class as well, the thing that distinguishes colonialism, this kind of colonialism that we are discussing in the class, and other ancient conquests like the Roman Empire or the Ottoman Empire, is that those empires did not try and force the colonies into a new economic system like this colonization did. As colonization was taking over, one of the things that happened was the simultaneous development of modernity, which was powered by capitalist enterprises, which led to this global division of labor, where the first world countries, export their labor to the third world countries because there the labor is cheap. There is no regulation of labor. They don't have to pay them anything. They can exploit them as much as they want because the country is desperate for some kind of foreign investment would let their people be exploited because there's no other way for them to survive. Now, when we talk about neocolonialism, we are referring to this particular phenomenon that even though formally these colonies are independent, it doesn't mean that they are economically independent, that they are allowed to make their own decisions, that they can run their countries the way they want. No. What happens is that there is constant interference and dictation of policy by big, international bodies like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, lots of other developmental paradigms. So basically what happens is that these people, when they became free, in certain cases when they were French colonies, the French colony, just to get the independence from the French levied so much taxation, and not just taxation, so much. So, for example, let's put it this way, that a lot of French colonies are still paying France simply because they took France's slave labor away. So you can imagine, and they can't say no because otherwise French armies would invade them, their independence would be taken away. So those countries cannot develop because these imperialist or ex-imperialist powers do not let them. In the same way, one of the leading emerging imperial power is the United States, and so a lot of neo-colonial power rests with the United States in the International Monetary Fund, dictating different countries' policies of how they should, they should or should not focus on welfare functions. Usually, they tell or dictate to the third world countries that they cannot have welfare functions because they need to pay them loans that were given at exorbitant interest rates. It's a very, very exploitative and predatory system that does not let these independent new countries develop, that does not let them look after their own people. And still, more than 50% of the money that these countries generate is given automatically to the first world countries, which includes Europe, which includes the United States and other countries. So basically, there is a huge disparity that is going on. Neocolonialism and neo-imperialism basically refers to that idea that even though, in fact, Kwame Nkrumah, who coined this particular, the Ghanaian nationalist who coined this term, used to say that this is basically exploitation without the responsibility. So now the states don't even have the responsibility of administratively managing the colonial areas. They just exploit the money from them. So it's a very problematic system, and there has been lots of documentation on it. There is a lot of critique of it coming from the Western academy too, and from other places as well. But unfortunately, because of the way the world's power rests, it still retains its power. Another thing to be mentioned in this is, of course, the role of the native elite in keeping this process going. Now, the nationalist native elite, they might have had really good intentions, but they were educated and trained by the Western powers, and for their own interests, they did exploit, and they keep exploiting their own people. So the actually popular people, or the actual popular people who support their own constituencies, are never given the chance to power. So this is what one theorist, Algerian theorist, Frantz Fanon, said, that he wrote a book called black skins, white masks, which basically is that these people might be colored people, but they still wear the white masks. They still carry on harming their own populations. So neocolonialism also refers to those particular practices of nationalist governments as well. I hope that idea is clear, and you will see that this kind of thing is you see neocolonialist practices taking place in the stories that we will read this and the next week as well. Then we have the second keyword, which is Pan-Africanism. Generally speaking, for an understanding, you don't need to remember dates or anything. The only thing you need to remember is that a lot of intellectuals got together in the 20th centuries, basically, for the freedom of the African populations that had been dispersed, populations that were still within Africa but were still colonized. So people like in America, Du Bois, the Harlem Renaissance movement, and other people from everywhere got together, and they were basically proclaiming an African state, a state where a unity of all African peoples against the imperialism that was completely taking over. That is a very, very reductive kind of approach to it, but just to make you understand that this was actually happening, so that you can locate this movement. Now, Pan-Africanism was both a literary movement and an actual movement, activist movement. The literary movement of it produced lots of texts in favor of an African unity based on the African descent. And literary movement also proclaimed the same things, but it was done through literature and arts and through a lot of other means as well. Now, this Pan-Africanist movement also had conferences. They had Pan-African conferences that resulted in the formation of the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity. Now, they were also critiqued by a lot of African people too, and the critique was because Pan-African, though it is done in a good sense, it is done for the betterment of African people, it still completely elides the individual character of different African tribes and African countries. It kind of puts everyone under the heading of African people just because of their race. So it becomes kind of reductive in many ways as well. Also, it focused a lot on nativist issues of so there is a critique about it from women's side as well, that it is it's not very representative of women as well. Now, to keep in mind, Africa is a very, very big continent, and it has many countries, it has many ethnic tribes within it. So just kind of bunching them together under one umbrella term is probably not a very good idea. Okay, the next term, the third term that we are going to look at is nativism, and we have already discussed this term in class 2, but I'm going to go over it. Nativism was it was I would call it a nationalist tendency or strategy that was employed against the imperial powers. So, for example, the people who were educated by the Europeans or educated in the European tradition decided to fight for their freedom using the Western models of democracy and Western models of freedom. And so, what they did was they basically said that we are a nation or a country and we are supposed to have our own freedom, and so the nationalist struggle was founded on it. Now the problem with it is, in order to proclaim themselves an independent group of people, they decided to go back in history and retrieve whatever they could think of from their own cultures, which is very problematic because you cannot reach an untouched, pristine, original form of your culture after hundreds of years of colonization. So what they retrieved was basically a culture that was very patriarchal, that was reductive, that automatically they did not bother retrieving women's roles, and women were reduced to a lower status. So the retrievals were basically nativist in nature. They were wanted to take on and place take fight for nationalist independence on nativist models, but nativist models, because they were predicated on something that couldn't exist, were very patriarchal, very anti-woman in many ways, and so they created set I would say a precedent for a lot of further exploitation down the line. So nativism is something that the post-colonial term nativism refers to this tendency for nationalist movements or freedom movements to reclaim an unreclaimable history, and in the interest of a ruling class or the majority men and not the women or other marginalized groups. So keep that in mind. That is important. And you can read further for detail in your module keyword sheet as well. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask me. And lastly, not lastly actually, we have two more terms. Apartheid. Apartheid basically refers to South African separation of the black population and the white population. Now, as you know, they were not allowed in apartheid to even talk to the black people were not allowed to go to the white areas. They were supposed to hold different identifications. They were not allowed to intermarry or to date, and apartheid has a whole history of excessive exploitation against black people. For example, look at the comedian Trevor Noah. He is a product of the apartheid state. He is, in his book, he talks about how he was a child. He wasn't legally allowed to exist because he was a child of a German father and an South African mother. So anyway, if you look at it, apartheid was very, very problematic, and it created a lot of problems for mixed race children. If you remember, we discussed how creolization happens and how miscegenation was viewed at that time, and how were the people who grew up, as soon as they had like one drop of, let's say, African or blood in them, they were considered black and they were relegated to certain roles. It's a whole history of exploitation. We will study Bessie Head's story in week 13. That deals with her own history, deals with apartheid as well. And then we have class and post-colonialism. It is important to keep in mind that we have discussed Marxism in the last week, and Marxism deals with class and class relationships. And in post-colonialism too, most countries are very stratified in class-wise. And it is important to keep in mind that stratification is, of course, a gift left by colonization as well. By cultivating this bourgeois class, the top class, to govern, they created this paradigm of like upper class, middle class, upper middle class, and then the lower classes, the laboring classes. So an analysis of any post-colonial story, of course, deals with class as well. However, we do not reduce every problem to the problem of class as well, because that can be a reductive reading, because there are other issues as well as class issues that take place. Now, let's move on to Jomo Kenyatta's story, Gentleman of the Jungle. It is a fable. It's a very, very short story. However, Kenyatta, who was a nationalist and he was the first president of, I think, Kenya. Yes. So he, in that story, talks about colonization and what colonization does, but he does it through the method of a fable. He talks about how there's a human, and how Mr. Elephant comes and like slowly takes over his house, and then the people support the elephant, and so this all the animals of the jungle support basically the animals coming over and taking each house that he builds, until finally he tricks them all into it and sets fire to it. Now, the point that I want, 2 or 3 points that I want you to think about in the story is, number one, that he is pointing towards the trickery that colonial powers employed in taking over the property of the colonized, how they themselves at first needed something, and when they were helped, they used that particular position of power to exploit. The second thing that I want you to draw your attention to is the systems that they put in place. This is very, very important aspect of the story. The systems of justice, the systems of property ownership, and the systems that decreed whether someone was right or wrong. These systems were very, very problematic towards African people, because no one bothered listening to the African people at all, and their property, their livelihoods, everything was taken away, and they were told in a very, very patronizing way that this was done for their own betterment. That is the second thing that I want you to consider. One, the fact that it was through trickery that they took over the African population. Number two, that the systems that they put in place were very, very detrimental. And the last is a revolutionary message that he gives in the story. The idea that you cannot bargain with them, you cannot reason with them, because they are not talking to you honestly. They are going to still exploit you as much as possible. So what is the way to overcome that kind of exploitation? Is simply by revolution, through fighting and forcing them to leave your country. Because he's a nationalist, so I hope that idea, I hope you get an understanding of like why he would work for, basically towards this. So I hope you enjoyed the story and are ready for the next week's stories as well. I'll come back and we will have a small lectures on other stories for week 13 as well. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.